One of my favorite things in the world to do is watch Friends. I know it's been off for years and years. It's not even around, but I still find myself binge watching old episodes. And I was thinking about this today and thinking, it's the predictability of the friends in the circle, right? You have Chandler with his quirkiness, Monica with her type A of just everything has to be so neat and tidy and organized. It's Phoebe's ability to make you laugh at her silly songs. Ross always comes in with those smart comments, and Joey and him and his food, like it is just so hilarious. And of course, Rachel, she just brings everybody together, and it's just such this beautiful, cohesive team of people. And it's why I wanted to come on and share with you today that I have an opportunity for you to find your friends in the content creation space. So if you are thinking about creating your first or your next digital course, I don't want you to miss this opportunity because Amy Porterfield just opened the doors for registration for her Course Confident Bootcamp. And I'm actually offering a special bonus for anyone that registers for the Course Confident Bootcamp through my special link. So I want you to go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register. That's crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And what you're going to find when you get there is I have this special bonus private podcast series. It's called Money Mindset for Creators. So I want you to go register for Amy's bootcamp, download the podcast, and immediately start listening to it, because what this training is set up to do is to help you get your mind right about monetizing your content, making money so that you can fuel your content creation dreams. So go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register for Course Confident. And I cannot wait for you to find your friends and find the people that will be there for you. Do you see what I did there? Yeah, nice little friends segue connection. Go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And I cannot wait to see you inside. Okay, let's get into today's episode. Okay, so if you've been listening for a while, you know I share from time to time the behind the scenes of what I'm actually doing right before I start recording. And today I'm going to tell you something real funny. Okay, so the title of this episode has to do with crosscasting. And I'm not going to lie, I was thinking to myself, okay, I've heard this term, but is that the actual right term? Because at the end of the day, it's really like a cross-promotion strategy, but that's a little bit different than what I'm specifically going to teach you here today, because we are actually talking about cross-casting. And don't worry, I'm going to explain all the things. I'm going to give you all the definitions, the pros, the cons, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But I had to look up, I was in the old Google looking at what is crosscast? Like, what does that actually mean? Am I using the term correctly? Because in the podcast industry, it's what I always refer to. But then I was like, wait, am I thinking of another word? So of course I look it up, and it has to do with fishing. So I'm just cracking up because my granddad was a fisherman. My brother loves to fish. My husband loves to fish. My kids love to fish, like all the things. And I'm just cracking up because I'm like, well, duh, that's what it means. Crosscast, like you're casting the reel. So anyway, just know if you often are Googling things, making sure you're looking up, like you're actually saying the right term, you are not alone. You are in good company, because we are going to talk about all things cross-casting today, but it has nothing to do with fishing. Okay, we're actually talking about podcasts. So let's get right to it. Welcome to the Profit Podcast, where we teach entrepreneurs how to start, launch, and market their podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Profit, and I'm so excited that you're here. Thanks for hanging out with me today, because if you've been trying to figure out the world of podcasting, think of this show as the time-saving shortcut you've been looking for. So let's get right to it, shall we? Okay, so like I said in the beginning, today we are going to talk all about a crosscast or crosscasting, whichever way you want to explain it or you want to tell others about it, because I know that you are curious about it. Even if you just hear that term, you're like, wait, what does this mean? And I promise by the end of this episode, you're going to be really curious to ask yourself, ooh, who can I do a crosscast with? Because it sounds like so much fun. So that's my little upfront to tell you that I hope that you do this because it can make your life easier and it can actually get your podcast in front of more people. Oh, yeah, you just perked up a little bit there, didn't ya? So first of all, what is a crosscast? What am I even talking about? So what I define a crosscast, and if you're new to my worlds, to my podcast and the way that I teach things, I make up a lot of my own definitions, okay? This isn't something that you're going to Google. Maybe I should start my own podcast dictionary, the way I define things, because if you didn't already know this, what some people call show notes, I call an episode description, and what I call show notes may be called something else to another person. So that's my little disclaimer that Crystal kind of does whatever she wants to with words. It's just how it goes around here. So a crosscast is whenever you have an interview with two people, right? You as the podcast host and another person, you have an interview, and then you decide to air this episode on both of your podcasts. So this is not an interview that you do with someone who is not a podcaster. Maybe they have a YouTube channel or they have a blog, or maybe they just are on a different kind of platform. But this is a conversation between two podcasters that is going to be aired on each podcast. Okay. Are you with me here? So technically, one person would still be the one that steers the conversation, because you can't have two hosts of a show where people are just talking back and forth. I guess you could do a time frame where you say, okay, I'm going to let you ask me 5 questions, and then I'm going to ask you 5 questions, and then we're going to swap. I don't know. You could figure that part out. But for the sake of explaining the definition of a crosscast, it is recording one piece of content that you will share on 2 different podcasts. Okay? Are you with me? Okay, good. So I hope you're nodding along. So a crosscast that I have been a part of is he was on my podcast first. So if you go listen to the interview that I did with Thomas Umstadt, I'm going to link to it in the show notes. So crystalprofit.com/episode 209. He has the Novel Marketing podcast as well. And we were talking about my upcoming book. And I say upcoming, the book is already launched, but at the point of us recording that episode earlier in 2020, the book had not launched. And we had met earlier in the year at the Spark Christian Podcast Conference. And I was like, you know what? I would love to have a conversation about your podcast journey. And he said, it would be really cool if we could do a crosscast and we could do a book coaching where we chat about your book and the plans that you have. And I could give you some advice, because that's what he does. He helps authors get published. And so what we did is we recorded our interview, and then he took parts of the interview. I don't know that he used all of it. And then he kind of added an intro to say, hey, this is what we did on, this was on the Profit Podcast. This is what we talked about. And then he aired, I sent him, he had all the audio files, and he aired our interview on his podcast. Now, we can go into, probably in another episode, I can go into the mechanics, the logistics of how you would format a crosscast to make sure it's beneficial to both audiences. But I wanted to talk about the pros and the cons, right? Because it's not all sunshine and rainbows whenever you have someone approach you and they say, oh my gosh, it would be so fun to do an interview with you. Let's do it, and let's air it on both of our shows. Okay. There are some pros and cons to doing this. So let's cover the good stuff first, right? The pros, and what I love about it, is it gives each podcast more exposure. So let's pretend that you and I are brand new baby podcasters, right? And we are walking hand in hand into this podcast journey together. But neither one of us have an audience, right? Neither one of it. Like, we're both starting from scratch, and we're like, okay, I kind of have some like pull in this network, so I think that I might be able to get some people to listen. And the other person says, yeah, I think, I have, a little bit of a network too. Why don't we have a conversation? And then we can share this conversation out to both of our networks, and I'll talk about my podcast, you'll talk about your podcast, and then at that point, we will have had doubled our exposure because I'm getting in front of your audience and you're getting in front of mine. Does that make sense? Like, we're going to have more exposure simply by airing this episode in front of, it's almost like you're standing on two stages simultaneously in front of different audiences. Okay, so that's the number one pro that I have for this, is for all you new podcasters that are trying to get in front of people. Now,
being a woman in business comes with its own unique set of challenges, but also so many opportunities. We get ahead by leaning in to what makes us different from business as usual. I'm Samantha Hartley, host of Profitable Joyful Consulting, inviting you to a special 6-episode series exploring the experience of being a woman in business. You want to hear from women consultants who've hit $1 million, who sell 6-figure engagements, or who've broken their own revenue ceilings? Yeah, those are my clients, and they'll be sharing too. Join me for 6 must-listen episodes that tackle key challenges for women consultants. Follow Profitable Joyful Consulting on your favorite podcast app.
I don't want to really call this a con. This is more like a caveat to that, is you can't just do a crosscast with someone that's not in your industry or not even close to your industry. So, perfect example is if I were to go on a fishing podcast, like, this would not make a lot of sense. If I were to talk about podcasting, then they would be like, wait, we don't care about that. We want to know about the best bass fishing spots in Texas. We don't care about your podcasting stuff that you're talking about. Can you just go back to talking about fishing? And I would say, oh, I'm not the person you want to interview for your show then, because we're not a good match. So you want to make sure that the person that you decide to do this with is aligned with your audience in some way, like they have people in their audience that would eventually become listeners of your show and vice versa. So that's number one. You can definitely get more exposure with the right parameters in place. So the second pro is you only have to create one piece of content. Oh my gosh, like, this is so appealing to everyone that feels like, oh my gosh, I'm on the hamster wheel of creating content. I need a new piece every week and I'm running out of ideas. And I know this is a lot of you. You tell me, Crystal, I've talked about my 10 favorite ideas that I had for my podcast. Now I don't know what to talk about anymore. And I'm like, well, first of all, we need to have another conversation, because I've had so many episodes. I will link to them in the show notes about brainstorming content ideas and coming up with new pieces of content. Okay, this is really important. This is one of my goals in life, is to never have another podcaster tell me they don't know what to talk about on their podcast. Okay, this is my superpower. So I want to make sure you go check that out. Again, crystalprofit.com/episode 209. I'm going to have some resources for you to create content, but you only have to create one piece of content whenever you do a crosscast. So it is one conversation, and then you are using that in 2 different places. Okay, you're not doing 2 separate interviews. It's not like you're setting up 2 separate Zoom calls or getting on Squadcast at 2 different times, or recording on Squadcast for an hour and then hitting stop and then saying, okay, now we're going to do the other interview. No, it's too much. That is a lot. There are reasons why you would do that, but that's not what we're talking about here today. We are talking about cross-casting, okay? That is exactly what we're talking about. And when you record an interview with the intention of using it in multiple places, it makes content creation that much easier. So here's the caveat to creating just this one piece of content. You have to set it up in a way that will benefit both audiences. So let's go back to the example of me and you, right? I'm just going to pretend that you have a podcast that is related to business. So if you wanted to know some of the higher level strategies of how you can use a podcast for your business, because that would benefit your audience, then I need to go into those, but also touch on some of the things that I know my audience would appreciate as well. So it's like you're blending the two audiences together. So earlier I said you're taking one piece of content and you're speaking it on two separate stages. Well, when you're actually delivering the content, right, you're creating this interview, I want you to have a blended approach. It's like you're taking two rooms of people and you're smashing them together into one big room so you can appeal to both rooms, both people. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. It makes sense in my mind, but maybe you're like, Crystal, you're in your own little world. I don't know what you're talking about. If that's you, reach out to me and we can have another conversation, because I want to make sure that you understand that we are just making sure that there is a through line between the two audiences. Again, going back to me talking to the bass fishing pros that thought they were going to hear about crosscasting, whatever. I don't even really know what that means. I just saw a bunch of pictures of like rods and reels on Google, and I was like, oh no, we're not talking about that. I don't even know what that means. I know, at least I know what a rod and reel is, right? But that's not what we're talking about here today. So again, the pros are more exposure for both podcasts and only creating one piece of content. Now, let's talk about the cons, okay? And we've kind of already tiptoed into this area, but the first one is your audiences don't align. Like you have this idea in your head of like, oh my gosh, this conversation is going to flow smoothly between these two audiences. But then you get to talking and you realize, oh my audience doesn't care about this. Or the other person is talking and they're just like, I don't really know that this is going to fly with my audience. Or to jump right into the second con, this particular episode could perform really well for one audience and be a total dud, flop, zero, nobody for another audience. So that is a con. And that's kind of what you have to go into the first crosscast you ever do a little bit, I don't want to say skeptical, but like you want to like kind of ease into it. Like don't have these high expectations that just because you have a great crosscast partner that you're going to do a promotional podcast with, it doesn't matter. Even if they have a huge audience, it may not translate to both audiences. I've had this happen to me before. I had someone come onto my show. They had this giant social media following. And I was really under the impression that if I just got this person on my show and, I shared it, then they would share it and I would get all these listeners and I would have millions of downloads and thousands of listeners forever and ever. Amen. That did not happen. Okay. Like, sorry, boop, I'm gonna burst your bubble. That didn't happen for me. It probably won't happen for you unless you walk into it knowing that your audiences are 100% aligned and that both are going to perform really well, or it's going to perform really well in front of both audiences. And there's honestly no way to guarantee that. There's no way to guarantee that, because I could tell you, I could be on, let's just say, Amy Porterfield's podcast, right? And then I could do this interview with her and maybe it performs really well on her show. And then I air it on this podcast, the Profit Podcast, but you don't care about what we talked about on her show because her show is about online marketing. And maybe you're not here to learn about, webinars or creating online courses. You're here to learn about podcasting. So you have to know your audiences on both podcasts and be able to understand, like kind of like have the pulse of what both audiences really want from you. So this is kind of just an introduction into crosscasting, and I want to do another episode that goes into the format and logistics of how it will actually work when you're setting up your very first crosscast with another podcaster, because honestly, and maybe this is just me, and I don't call them rules, okay? Y'all have probably heard me say this before. I don't like rules. I like the word guidelines. I have a few guidelines that I live by before I have a guest on my show, before I will even email someone that emails me, like I email them back, reply to them whenever they pitch me for a podcast guest. Like I have very specific guidelines that I adhere to, and I bring those into crosscasting as well. Like if some rando on Instagram sends me a DM and they're like, hey, you want to do a crosscast? I'm gonna be like, whoa, like that's kind of jumping the gun. No, that's not how this works. So I want you to be the same with your show. Even if you have a baby podcast, even if you're just starting, it is in its infancy, I want you to protect your show and not just have someone, it's almost like taking advantage of you, right? Like taking advantage of your platform. If they're like, oh, I'm just getting started, can we do this and, have this conversation and I'll promote it on mine and you promote it on yours. Well, if you're not feeling it, if you're not jiving with that, then don't do it and don't feel like you have to. Okay. I see this all the time where people are saying more often in groups that they had a conversation with someone and they thought it was amazing and the person shared all this information, but they didn't really know this person. It was like an outside pitch. It wasn't a referral. It was someone that just randomly, emailed them. Well, now they're asking them to retract it. I see this so often now, and it's coming up more and more where people are saying, I don't actually want you to share that on the podcast. Can you take it down? Can you take that down? Because I don't, y'all, this never happens to me. Okay. Like I've never once had a guest come back to me and say, can you take our episode? And I've done lots of interviews. I've done, oh my gosh, I'm like scared to even put a number out there. I would say 60 or more interviews, probably higher than that, probably getting closer to 100 interviews. And I've never once had someone ask me to take the interview down. But I see this all the time and it really baffles me. But then I started thinking, well, it's because I don't take random people on the internet that ask to be on my podcast. Even when I was like, I was going to say younger, even when I was a little baby podcaster, even when I was just starting out, I knew this about me because I know that the integrity of my podcast and keeping that relationship with this audience, you listener, like I hold our relationship higher than I do pleasing someone. I can't even tell you, y'all, this is like, it's funny because this is not a brag worthy thing. This is one of those things that I just want to tell you, if this happens to you, it happens to me all the time. I have probably 7 DMs right now on Instagram I haven't responded to. I should probably just delete them, right? But it's people telling me how amazing they are and how incredible they would be for my podcast, but I don't even know who they are. And they've never once said how they could add value to my show. It's just about how incredible they are. And I'm like, I don't care about you. My audience doesn't care about you. Like, you got to give me something more than that for me to even consider listening to you. That sounds harsh. When I say it out loud, I'm like, that sounds a little harsh, Crystal. Maybe you should rein it in and not really show your true colors. But it's true. It's true. It's because I want to add value to this show. I don't care about the randos that are emailing me and sending me stuff on Instagram. I care about the people that I know. First of all, most of the interviews that I get are by referrals. There are a few trusted companies that pitch me often, and most of the time, like 90% of the time, I say yes immediately because I've vetted these people and they know the good matches for my show. So I feel like I'm going on like a totally different tangent, but I just want you to know that it's okay to be picky with who you do your podcast with, whether it's interviews or crosscasting or your co-host. It's okay to be picky. I want you to be picky. I want you to hold the relationship that you have with your audience to a higher standard than these strangers who are telling you that they're Fortune 500 CEOs and they've made millions of dollars and they've won all these awards. I don't care, y'all. I don't. I really don't. Like, I have had better conversations with people who, in their own words, have not succeeded at like anything in life, but the conversations are amazing whenever I talk to someone who just isn't full of themselves. Oh my gosh, I feel like I'm going off on a totally different tangent. We're going to wrap this up. We're going to wrap this up for today because that feels like a ranty thing that I need to explore a little bit more on the Potty Report. So we're going to put a pin in that. Go check out the Potty Report next week and we'll probably have some conversations about that. But to sum up, what is a crosscast? It's where you are having one interview and you're promoting it on two separate podcasts. Like I said, we're going to have an upcoming episode that's going to tell you the logistics and the formatting of how you actually do this well. But I wanted to introduce this concept to you. So going into your next year calendar, you can look at, okay, how can I add in some crosscast promotions for my show? So that's the definition. The pros are it gives you more exposure for you and the person you're doing the interview with. So both of your podcasts will get in front of your audiences. The second pro is you only have to create one piece of content. Hello, this is incredible and it will make your life so much easier. We do have some cons. You have to make sure that both of your audiences align because if they don't, it could be a total flop. Like that's the second con. It could do really well for one and not so well for the other. So you want to make sure that your audiences are at least somewhat aligned. It can't be two total polar opposites of like people that would never listen to another type of show. But that's all I have for you today. So make sure you go check out the show notes, crystalprofit.com/episode 209 to check out all the things that we talked about here today. And I'm just really excited for some of the fun things that we have coming up. And actually, I wanted to tell you about something really cool. So I am part of the Buzzsprout Creator Program, and they are trying out some new features that I really can't wait to get your feedback on. So if you heard an ad in the middle of this episode, tell me what you thought about it. Was it a little like kind of off-putting? Did you like it? Did you enjoy it? Did you say, oh my gosh, how did Crystal do that? Did she do that herself? No, I did not. This is actually a test that we're doing with Buzzsprout, and I'd love to hear your feedback. So reach out in the Profit Podcast online community. You'll see a link to it in the show notes if you're not already there. This is our Facebook group where we have conversations with podcasters every single week. I share stories there I don't share anywhere else. And there are chances for you to promote your own podcast whenever we do our Wednesday Plug Your Podcast post. So check that out in the show notes. Let me know what you thought about the ad you heard in this episode. And as always, remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere. Hey, Profit Podcast listeners. Thanks for sticking around to a little bit after the episode to hear this special message because I want to hear from you. We are starting a new segment called Fan Mail Shoutouts, and I want to hear from you and I want to hear your questions. What do you want to know? What questions have you been dying to ask me? So here's how to make this happen. Go to the app where you're listening to this podcast right now. Go there. I'll wait a second. Okay. Now, once you're there, you're going to see a hyperlink at the top of the episode description that says, send Crystal a text message. And that's all I want you to do. Send me a text. It could be casual, informal. It could be totally anonymous. Or if you want, you can include your name and the name of your podcast or content wherever you are creating, and I will give you a special shout out in an upcoming episode. So again, go to the show notes for where you're listening to this episode right now, and it will say, send Crystal a text message. And I cannot wait to hear from you and give you a shout out in an upcoming segment of Fan Mail Shoutouts.